Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Practice Center. My name is Joey, and I'm here to talk about all of the things mindfulness, forgiveness, and attitudinal healing. And today's topic is specific to the forgiveness process. I'm going to be including some of the work of Dr. Fred Luskin from the Stand for Forgiveness Project, as well as the way that Attitudinal Healing International speaks about forgiveness as a life skill. Before I dive into the explanations and what it's connected to and all the topic, what it is and what it isn't, I'd like for you to consider, in what ways do you think about forgiveness? Like, when does that come up for you as a topic? When do you think to yourself, I need to forgive, or I can't forgive, or I won't forgive, or I will forgive but not forget? Like, under what context do you think about that? What kind of framework do you use? What kind of meaning have you given to the word forgiveness? I think it's important to start there. Otherwise, this just becomes an intellectual practice or a process, and it's not very helpful to actually giving us tools to let go. So giving us tools to feel better, giving us tools to lean more into joy and love. So there's lots of different ways to talk about forgiveness, and I'm not quite sure all of the ways that you can talk about forgiveness, because I talk about it in a very specific way, which is secular. So there's a breakdown right there. There's a way that religious groups and churches talk about forgiveness. I'm a Lutheran pastor's kid for a section of my life. And so the way that religion talks about forgiveness, kind of this thing that you just do, it's important to forgive. It's, next to godliness. That's one of the things you need to do to get into heaven. All of these big, heady, concepts. And as a kid, I'm like, what? Well, I'm doomed. If that's what I need to do to get into heaven, then I'm screwed, because that was one of the things that was I think one of the bigger fights that I had with my adoptive parents. It was my inability to say I'm sorry. So for the way that I grew up around forgiveness is that somebody has to say I'm sorry, and then you're forgiven, and then you have a clean slate, then you can move on. And because I was like, well, I'm not sorry, so I couldn't be forgiven. And so I compounded a lot of grievances from other people. And so that caused some labels to be put on me. And the way that I was then treated, I think, was harsh and unfair in a lot of ways. So then how do I do that for others? I think that passed on to me for a long time. I held on to grievances, and I held on to unforgiving thoughts and feelings in my body, because the way that the scenario worked was that then somebody needed to say I'm sorry in order for me to forgive, because that's how I lived. Like, I wasn't forgiven because I was not able to say I'm sorry, or I didn't want to. I didn't think it was necessary or needed. So, what a detrimental spiral that put me in. I can't say I'm sorry, so I'm never forgiven. And I don't forgive people because they didn't say I'm sorry. So is that how you think about forgiveness? And if so, then I have good news for you. I think this talk might be helpful for you. It was absolutely helpful for me to allow myself some space to actually live the life that I wanted, versus just being an accountant of all of the wrongdoings that others were doing. So welcome to Forgiveness as a Life Skill. Our focus for today's talk is we want to look at forgiveness as a tool to reclaim our peace of mind. Our peace of mind. So right now, just gauge for yourself how you would rate yourself in terms of having peace of mind. So if I were to give you a scale between 1 and 10, I would ask you, generally speaking, are you walking around with peace of mind, or are you not? And then you can bet that against practicing some of these tools and then gauging yourself again. We're going to look for ways to see forgiveness as a way of changing our own perspective to reduce our own suffering. The picture of suffering, which is something happened that you didn't want to happen, or something didn't happen and you wanted to happen. So there's a gap between want and what you got. And in that space, in order for suffering to occur, I need to take that very personally. Why didn't that happen for me? What's wrong with me? Why not me? Never me. It's unfair. And then there's a lot of my energy dedicated to ruminating. I think about it a lot. I bring it up a lot. I might talk about it a lot, or it just might be going around in my head. And it might keep me from sleeping. But there's an element of rumination, like chewing of the cud, the chewing of that story again and again and again and again. These might be stories that just happened, or it might be stories from 10, 20, 30, 40, 70 years ago. And then there's definitely an element of blame. So we've assigned the blame to someone, something outside of ourselves, or maybe even to ourselves, or it's my fault, or it's the planet's fault, it's racism's fault, it's capitalism's fault, it's your fault, it's the weather's fault, somebody's fault for me feeling so poorly about this thing that I didn't get. So that's the definition of suffering. So we're looking for ways to see forgiveness as a way of changing our own perspective so that we do reduce some of that suffering. We're going to explore the meaning of the word forgiveness in the way that we're talking about it here in the forgiveness process, common resistance to forgiveness, practical steps, and we might use some, I'm going to offer a creative visualization process that can support your ability to forgive. And we're going to really be looking at forgiveness as a choice for love, choice for love. So jumping right in, let's look at some of the research on forgiveness and what that has to say. And generally speaking, we're looking at the Stanford forgiveness process, forgiveness and health, even some of the work of Dr. Gabor Mate. And when you look at the body of research around forgiveness as a whole, there's some really interesting findings. Some of it is that it's teachable and it's a learnable skill. It's not something that you're just born with or something that you're just naturally good at. And if you're not, you're screwed. It's not that. It's a set of skills that is teachable and learnable. It impacts every part of our lives. So sometimes we think, I'm being unforgiving for this one situation. But generally speaking, I'm open in all other areas. What the research is saying is that it impacts every part of our lives. So if I'm holding onto a grudge here, that it's going to impact the general sense of peace of mind. It's going to generally impact other relationships. And it's definitely going to impact my body, my immune system, my cardiovascular system. It's linked to migraines. I mean, just some really phenomenal research. Forgiveness and health particularly does a good job of outlining that. Another piece of the finding is that forgiveness is a choice. And in fact, right now, if you think about a story that you've been holding on to, and just in this moment, take a deep breath and imagine letting it go. Imagine that this story is no longer impacting you, no longer following you around. Just imagining letting it go will allow you to feel better. So just do that little piece and see how you feel. Even if you're like, no, I'm not going to forgive. Just imagine, just for right now, give yourself that moment. The research says that even that works. Pretty cool. So let's think about forgiveness as a whole. Do you know what it feels like to hold on to a grievance? Do you know what it feels like to be unforgiving? Yeah, how does it feel in your body? What are the thoughts that you think about? Who do you usually call and ask about that or talk to about that or wanted to unload around that? So notice, you know what it feels like to forgive? Like think back to a time when you were holding on to something and you ended up forgiving. How does that feel? What do you think about? How does your body feel? So most likely you answered yes to both of those. You know what it feels like to hold on to a grievance, and you know what it feels like to let go. So, I mean, this is an interesting thought. We all then know how to forgive. We've done it before. And we know that it feels better when we let go, right? For the most part, you've like, yeah, it feels better to have let go. So then the question is, why then do we choose not to forgive? What are some of the reasons? What are some of the reasons you have to not forgive? What are some reasons that people have in general to hold on to grievances? So what are some of those? So generally speaking, these are the common resistance. There's a fear of vulnerability. And vulnerability means uncertainty. Like, what would happen if I let go? I'm not sure. Like, I know what it feels like to hold on. So what would it feel like in the context of that relationship to let go? So that uncertainty is a common resistance, or that I might have to risk emotional exposure in order to let go. Those are common resistances. Most of us don't like to take risks around emotional exposure, because what would they think? What would they say? How would they feel? What would they think of me? Those are all things that might come along with having to expose our emotional state. The fear of feeling wrong in our grievance story. Some of us go, I don't know if I have the right to be mad about this. I don't know if I have the right to feel like I was wronged. So feeling wrong in our grievance story is a common resistance. Fear of losing power. Like some of us who lean into anger, like if I let go of that anger, then what? Because it feels powerful to hold on to that anger, or that righteousness, or that I'm on this value high horse. And to come down off of that might feel like losing power. No longer feeling special in our grievance story. There are some of us who have our whole identity consumed by that grievance story. We have a whole, like, there's language and words that we give to people who have been grieved. So we might call people survivors, for example. And so if you're no longer a survivor, then what? So there's a specialness bestowed upon certain kinds of folks who have been grieved. There's a fear of loss of support by those who supported your grievance story. I mean, perfect example is when there's a breakup. There's lots of language around, like, friends having to choose sides. And then the friends who have chosen your side, right, might have listened to you for ages or years on like how that other person was a villain, and they were like, yeah, and rallied for you. And so if you are now letting go of that story, what might that mean for that support group that you've built up? So maybe that's why we're holding on to grievances. Fear of acknowledging or owning our own revenge fantasies, these fantasies of regaining power or to teach a lesson. Some of us, when we even look at the word revenge fantasies, automatically feel this resistance, like that doesn't seem like a helpful thing. I don't do that. My religion prohibits me from doing that. Culturally, this is not appropriate. So just our relationship around the word revenge fantasy might be a block. Or let's say the word isn't a block, but just the nature of acknowledging that in our minds, we create these fantasies of turning the tables on our offender, and we might not like that image that's coming up for us. So our inability or unwillingness to look at that might prevent us from moving on. Or some of us have leaned so far into these revenge fantasies and kind of playing it out in our minds. This is not a healthy place to be either. It's something that we move through, but we don't stay at. But some of us are stuck there, the same way that some of us are stuck in grief. And to let it go and to move through it might not feel good. And so we will stay holding on to our grievance stories because we don't want to give up our revenge fantasies. So notice if any one of these speaks to you. And there isn't much guidance except for just notice them and be with yourself around that in acceptance. Have some compassion for yourself. These are all mechanisms to try and help you stay safe, to try and help you maintain some sort of equilibrium so that you can live the life that you're currently living. So these aren't bad things if you recognize them. Just embrace them, be with yourself. Recognizing resistance is an important step. So let's go through what forgiveness is not. In the way that we're talking about today, I'm not encouraging us to forget what it is that happened to us. It's not about showing weakness. It's definitely not about offering some sort of excuse to our offender or villain or failed protector. It's not excusing their behavior. It's not saying, well, they've had a tough life, so I understand that this is what they've done. It's not really excusing their behavior. Understanding and excusing are two different things. It's not about reconciliation. So if you forgive, it doesn't mean that you have to go back now and reconcile with the offender, villain, or failed protector. That's a separate conversation. Reconciling it, renewing it, restoring those relationships, that's a separate conversation to the forgiveness process itself. This is not about condoning behavior that hurt us. So this is not saying that because you forgive, you that we are condoning that behavior that hurt you in the first place. Yeah. And this is not relinquishing our right to seek justice. So because I can let go and have more space doesn't mean then I don't hold that offender accountable, especially if there's a law that's broken. And let's say there's a court case coming up. Your ability to forgive isn't linked to then you going out and seeking justice. You can still go out and testify and hold that person accountable. You just don't have to hold that hurt and pain inside of you. So forgiveness specifically is not these things. So forgiveness is, in the context of what we're talking about it, I would like to offer some quotes from some very important people doing this research or doing the big F, the big forgiveness work. So see if any of these quotes draw you in. So Dr. Fred Luskin talks about reclaiming power over our own peace of mind. So instead of renting space up here to the wrongdoings of people that are no longer in our lives, it's reclaiming that space and claiming it for a place of peace. It is changing our perspective so that we can reduce our own suffering. So some of this work in that suffering scenario, some of it is around perspective. And if we can shift that, then we can actually shift our ability from feeling bad to feeling better. Dr. Jerry Jampolsky of Attitudinal Healing International talks about forgiveness as giving up all hope for a better past. It is the key to our happiness. Sometimes when we're caught up here in today, we spend a lot of time hashing up what's happened and what should have happened in the past. Well, we have no time machine. We can't go back there and actually change the thing. We can change our perspective around it. We can let that go. We can actually root ourselves in the present moment and want something different for our future. But we can't make the past do something that it didn't already do. Bishop Desmond Tutu talks about forgiveness as to release yourself from whatever trauma and hardship you've experienced and reclaiming your life as your own and not at the mercy of this traumatic past. Reclaiming your life as your own. Far too long, I lived my life at the mercy of all the things that were done to us. So in fact, I would point to everything that was going on wrong today and say it's because of my mom, because of that event, because of these people, because of the systems that were created. That's why I can't have the life that I really want today. I mean, what kind of a passive life is that? So to really reclaim life and to take personal and authentic responsibility for what's happening here takes an amount of skill for us to let go of stuff that has happened in the past. Depression often, not the clinical depression, but depression can often be talked about as an unhealthy clinging on to events of the past, and anxiety as an unhealthy clinging on to future events that we have like no possibility of knowing what's going to happen, much less controlling it. Yeah. So reclaiming life as our own is firmly rooted in this present moment. Some other quotes, and this is, I think, my personal favorite, because knowing the story of President Nelson Mandela is to know that he experienced some horrific conditions in apartheid South Africa. But when he was freed, he said, when I walked out of the gates of that prison, I knew that if I continued to hate these people, his guards, I'd still be in prison. And this is a man who the story goes, on one of his first days, he was asked to dig a ditch the size of a burial plot. And then after he finished digging, he was told to lay down in it. And these guards urinated at him as he lay down in this grave, not knowing if he was going to be covered up after that, right? Can you imagine the amount of trauma and the amount of hate that you could rightfully hold against these guards that did this to you, right? Some of us could carry that on for decades and decades. But for Nelson Mandela, he knew as he was being freed that if he held on to that story, that he'd still be in prison. And then that would have prevented him from then doing all the works that he did after he was freed. Maya Angelou, another one of my favorites, her quote, "You can't forgive without loving." Forgiveness and love go hand in hand. I love that concept. You can't forgive without loving. And I don't mean this sentimental kind of like love that February 14th, Valentine's Day kind of love. That's how I picture it. I don't mean sentimentality. I don't mean mush. I mean having enough courage to stand up and say, I forgive. I'm finished with it. I love that. And then Lewis B. Smead says, to forgive is to set a prisoner free, discovering that that prisoner was you. So do any of these call to you? Think about a quote that might be meaningful to you as we embark on the rest of the steps to forgiveness. A lot of these speak about courage, speaks about choice. It's about unburdening and unprisoning yourself. Dismantling this mental slavery piece. Yeah, that's what real forgiveness is about. It has nothing to do with that other person, really. It doesn't bestow onto that other person anything. This is about your willingness to claim peace and joy and happiness for yourself in your life in this present moment. Forgiveness, though, is not only tied to love, it is directly tied to grief. So grief to me is the track, is the doorway, is the welcome mat to this road that ends in forgiveness. So it is only through entering through grief that we'll get to forgiveness. So grief is this natural response to being offended, hurt, or violated. It represents a loss. You didn't get something, or something was done to you that you did that took away safety or dignity or a sense of belonging. And so that's a loss that needs to be grieved. And if we think we can just kind of brush that off, well, therein lies the issue. If we can only get to forgiveness through the grief door, if we're unwilling to recognize that we're grieving, then we cannot get to this place of letting go. So what is your willingness to grieve? Do you recognize the losses in your life? Do you recognize the losses that are inherent in our grief stories? Because all of our grievance stories is a recognition of this loss. It might be out of your awareness, but the more that you can become aware of that and discuss it, it'll be integral to this forgiveness process. People who are unable to forgive are often struggling with some part of the grieving process. So if you are in denial, if you're not even, there are some people who tell me that they have no grievance story when we come into a mindful forgiveness workshop. And then eventually, after maybe 2 or 3 weeks, they'll tell me this horrific story of how they were violated, where their safety and dignity and their sense of belonging were all ripped apart and dismantled. And yet it was maybe so big, so horrific, or lacked so much support that they didn't even see it. There are some of us who are unwilling to lean into the sense of anger, thinking that anger is bad. We've been taught that anger is bad, but it is a healthy part of an emotion. I think what we deem as bad might be suppressed anger that might come out as like retaliatory acts or violent acts of hostility. Yeah, I don't know that those are good, but anger is a part of our emotional language. And the more that we can grasp onto the full range, the better off we might feel. So bargaining is a natural part. Depression or sadness, and then finally coming to some sort of acceptance. So just recognizing which part we might struggle with and getting support around that will be really helpful. So support might look like counseling or therapy or group, or finding some people where you feel safe, and then seeing if you can really be heard around your grievance story is going to be an important piece of the journey. And then now I want to clarify this word. So the same way that when I put up the word revenge fantasies, or some people have a disconnection to the word grief, some of us who have been in this work decided that we don't like the word resilience because we've been misusing it for a long time. Resilience is a label that was put on me for a very long time, at a time when I know I was not resilient. But a lot of people conflated this word with strength, or conflated this word with pretending to be strong, conflated this word resilience with our ability to forget about it. Right? But resilience, what it actually is this capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. It has to do with toughness and ability to spring back, but it's more about flexibility than strength. And if we look at the pillars of resilience, it might clarify that a little bit. To be resilient, we have to be super self-aware. There's got to be an awareness that we were hurt and that we are intentionally letting go versus suppressing. For a long time, when I was given that title of resilience, I was suppressing. Like, I was so disconnected. Often when I look back at my stories, I'm not embodied at all. I'm actually like this head watching this body called Joey going through life. I was absolutely disconnected. I was numb. And in fact, I got a lot of flack for that, like as unemotional or cold, people would say. And that was just disembodied, disconnected. And that was a survival mechanism. Absolutely. I had no self-awareness around that, except for I knew what I was doing was bad. And then in certain circles, it was good because I was resilient. It was very confusing. So there is an element of self-awareness. To be resilient, you are intentionally understanding what you're thinking, and also your emotional landscape, and then making some choices around what you're going to do or not do. But it is not about suppression. So in order to do that, we have to be fully rooted in this present moment. So mindfulness is an integral part of resilience. So mindfulness is about being present in this moment, no matter what, with acceptance. No matter what, with acceptance. So to be super aware and to be mindful means that some moments I'm super angry. And that instead of judging myself for being angry, that I am there fully in my anger. And maybe I'm getting some support so that I can be heard around that, to say, I'm really angry and I have a right to speak on that in this present moment. That's mindful and self-aware, right? People who then say, well, to be angry is not very mindful, means that you don't understand the word mindful. Yeah. Mindfulness is about being present in the moment, no matter what, with acceptance. And a lot of no matter what it's terrible conditions. A lot of times I don't feel good. I do feel sad. I do feel disconnected. And to be aware of that in the moment and to be there fully in support of myself versus judging myself is important. And then to do the work of self-care. So self-care means, can I be present with myself and take care of the business that are causing me concerns? So sometimes self-care can look like, if I need to cry, allowing myself to cry. If I'm angry, allowing myself to feel that anger. Sometimes self-care can mean that in the past, I have disconnected from myself and pretended like a lot of things weren't happening. And so I didn't take care of my business. So self-care might be like recognizing, oh, I've let myself go, or I didn't take care of this important part of my life, and then starting to take care of that. That's what self-care means. Not like, oh, I need a vacation or I need to go treat myself. There might be a place for that, but self-care really means to take care of your business of living in this present moment. And then one of the other pillars of resilience is, what kind of relationship do you have in life with other people? We're co-relational beings. I didn't have a lot of relationships that were positive in my life. And so for people to call me resilience, recognizing that I was burning relationships left and right, told me that they didn't understand what resilience was. Positive relationships means that I am connected to other humans in a meaningful way as I walk through life. Yeah. So look at the quality of the relationship that you have in your life. Do you just have relationships because, family and parents have to be together? You know what I mean by quality of your relationships. So really look around, go, do I have meaningful friendships? Do I have meaningful relationships? And then do you have some sort of connection to your purpose of being? Do you think about that? And do you lean into that? So those are the pillars of resilience. So if you're talking about resilience and it doesn't incorporate those purpose or these pillars, then perhaps you're using the wrong word. Or you can kind of dissect these areas and figure out where you can do a little bit more practice around. So that you can really build up the sense of resilience. So resilience is important for several reasons. It enables us to develop a mechanism for protection against experiences which could be overwhelming. So it almost inoculates ourselves from creating grievances in the future. It helps us to maintain balance in our lives during difficult or stressful periods. So when something stressful happens, that means something happened that I didn't want to happen, that I'm more quickly able to be self-aware and be mindful and take care of my business and maintain my relationships with people in purpose so that I don't start to take it personally, ruminate on it, and then blame everybody else. That I'm able to take authentic responsibility so that I don't create grievance stories going on into the future. It can also help protect us from developing mental health difficulties or physical ailments. As we saw, unforgiving and resentments can lead to physical ailments. So resilience might be the inoculation against future grievance stories, that which then you don't have to forgive, right? If you don't create grievance stories in your life, then you don't have to let them go. So we're coming at this from both angles. So think about how you're using resilience, that word. Are you using it appropriately, or are you using it to call, like to look at kids who are not being troublesome to you because they're suppressing their emotions and calling that good, calling that resilient? If they're suppressing, that's not good. Yeah, helping each other to be more aware and then to express ourselves more helpfully might be more helpful. Okay. These are the 9 steps to forgiveness. So if you're looking up the Stand for Forgiveness Project with Dr. Fred Luskin, these are the steps that are going to be coming up for you. These are the steps that we actually work on during the Mindful Forgiveness workshop. So if you've seen some of the workshops offered by myself and the other facilitators, these are some of the steps that we go through. So please take a moment, and maybe you're going to freeze this so you can walk through these steps yourself. And then maybe you'll have some questions, and please comment them below. It's really helpful actually to get these videos out to more people if you interact with it. So either like it or don't like it or make a comment on it. Definitely subscribe to the practice channel, the Practice Center's YouTube channel, and that helps build some momentum so we can get some of this information out to those of us who are out here who are struggling and who would need some concrete steps. And here are the remainder of the steps. Some of the steps that a lot of people find really helpful is for us, day 4 or session 4 out of 6 is unenforceable rules. This is kind of the mechanism that starts the creation of our grievance story. Unenforceable rules are kind of like these values or the ways that life should be, that we try to have other people hold accountable to. So for example, everybody should be as nice as I am. Yeah. And in that statement, I don't even recognize how sometimes I am not very nice or I am not very kind, but yet I want others to be accountable to that at all times, and that I can somehow like be angry if they are not. Everybody should see religion the way I do. Everybody should be as fair as I am, or everybody should manage their time like I do. And if they don't, then the real indicator is if I have a physical reaction, like I feel tight, I feel angry, I feel terse, if somebody's behaving in a way that is contrary to the way that I would behave. These are unenforceable rules. Like, who are we to set up the rules of engagement for everybody else? Yeah, it seems silly when we put it on that, but this is the mechanism that gets us into the most trouble. Like, for example, how many of you guys are partnered and really feel like your partner, because they've known you for a month, 9 years, a lifetime, that they should know how to make you feel loved, and yet here you are feeling the feelings of them not knowing how to make you feel loved. So once we recognize that, time doesn't do anything for people to know how love should feel for you, then we can take some responsibility to communicate that better, right? If I'm not shitting on you. if I don't expect you to know how for you to make me feel loved or accepted, then I might have to take it upon myself to communicate to you that, when you do this or when you say this, that's what makes me feel like loved. Uh, Unenforceable rules tends to be one of these chapters that feels very concrete for folks. So in order to get to that chapter, we have to go through all the other steps. So I invite you to join me in a group. Ultimately, our goal is, and when I say we, I mean the mission of the practice center and me personally, like why I do this work is I hear and I do subscribe to like our job on this planet to make life a little bit easier or more peaceful. But when I look at the world as a whole and all I see is mess and global warming and just chaos and infighting, it feels daunting. I'm like, how do I participate in this thing called wanting to offer more peace on earth? Well, I can't. But what I can do is kind of rewind it back a little bit and go, okay, if I myself can live with a little bit more peace and then communicate that in my immediate sphere and then continue to pass that on, perhaps that's the answer. So I invite you to think about like what your life might look like when the grievances that you're holding is no longer an issue. How might you feel? How would it feel to truly be free of the burdens of thinking and suffering about past events? What would it be like to know that you survived this hardship, but it no longer drives or controls you? Can you imagine using this experience in some positive or even heroic way? I don't know that I'm using this in a more heroic way, but I knew that when I was suffering around my adoption story and my disconnection from my adoptive family, and then my subsequent many failed relationships. When I was suffering in that, I was tight, I was angry. That's all I could pass on was more tightness and more anger. And now, as I get a little bit more space around it, and I've learned some of the lessons, and then I can truly feel a little bit more peace. The way that I'm interacting with my immediate life and my immediate people around my life and the work that I'm able to do, I think is spreading a little bit more positivity and peace and joy. It does feel differently in the way that I'm walking life now than when I was walking, when I was holding on to so many grievances. Like my hands were not free to extend love. Yeah, so I definitely see a difference in my life. So I'm wondering what difference you'd see in your life. So I'd like to summarize living forgiveness as a life skill. So forgiveness is a skill of reclaiming peace of mind for you, and it will take practice, and it might be ugly along the way. You, me, anyone can learn to forgive. I mean, just look at little kids on the playground. I think as we've become more railroad parents and helicopter parents, this might be a little bit less apparent, but I remember, fighting something fierce with little ones, being so angry, and then like next minute you're best friends. I remember seeing that in my children as they grew up and they were fighting with their friends. They'd be like, I hate so and so. And then the next day they would kiss and make up and share toys and be best friends again. I mean, we were born with this ability to let things go relatively quickly. We become more calcified if we allow ourselves in our age. But what if we made the choice to continue practicing that which we already had, this ability to let go, this ability to forgive? Forgiveness is a change of perspective that reduces our own suffering. It has nothing to do with the other person. Forgiveness is a personal choice. No one can force us to forgive or not to forgive. Forgiveness is the natural conclusion to grieving. So again, go back to your willingness to grieve. Dr. Luskin talks about two problems with grief. One, people don't do it enough. Two, some people do it too much. So it's about finding that sweet spot of being able to grieve until you feel done. Grieve until you feel done. And then practicing forgiveness helps us to be more resilient. So our ability to practice right now will give us a better chance of forgiving future things because things are gonna happen in the future. If we are so lucky as to live day to day and in this human experience, then grievances are gonna come up. We're gonna be offended. Yeah, but practicing this skill to forgive right now will more likely allow us to forgive quicker and easier in the future. I appreciate you joining me in this conversation around forgiveness. So just imagining forgiving might make you feel better, but actually going through the steps, if you're holding on to some stories that are really making you immobile almost, unable to love or extend love or compassion or grace to others, this might be an important process for you to engage in. I invite you to group with me. There are other facilitators. You can read Dr. Fred Luskin's book on forgiveness, practice it yourself or work on it with your therapist, but I think it is a worthy endeavor to take up. Thanks for spending this time with me, and I look forward to our next conversation.